It is a great crowd here today, but always on daylight savings times. Either way it goes, I always question, I always say, did you mean to be here? Did you know you were coming to 9 o'clock service this morning? I never can keep straight whether you'd have been early or late to it. But I thought about it this past weekend. I was gone. It was Halloween. And so I really can't, I'm not saying it's never happened, but I can't not remember being at Macedonia when it was Halloween. In years past, Night of Lights and Trunk or Treat and things like that. But rest assured, I was at a NASCAR race, so I had enough costumes and characters. I didn't miss anything because when you go to NASCAR, you get to see it all. I made the decision. I had several people ask me, said, you didn't send me any pictures of anybody. I said, I couldn't get my phone out quick enough. Next year I'm going to put a GoPro on my head and just have a remote control and just snap pictures. Because I'll get some good stuff there. I saw enough stuff that just makes you go, blah. It was just like Halloween. Let me ask you something. Do you like scary movies? Who are, just raise your hand seriously if you're a scary movie person. All right. Apparently, not enough of you here, but they're making millions off of them somewhere else then because scary movies are a big thing. I got to looking at it this week as I was thinking about it. Zombies are nothing new, but I look back to see when the first movie that I can remember that was made about zombies, and it was Night of the Living Dead in 1968, a black and white film, filmed in black and white in Pennsylvania. And I thought that was it. But what is the most popular one that's got zombies in it now? The Walking Dead. Yeah, and they really don't call them zombies anymore. For the fans of the show The Walking Dead, what do they call them? Walkers. Okay, one person here watches that. Okay. I don't know whether to thank you or pray for you. But it's gone on for 11 seasons, The Walking Dead. 11 seasons. And a few years ago, it was the most watched television series of any other with a young adult demographic. Well, what is a zombie? You think about and you watch the movies, you see it, you hear about what is a zombie. Now, this is the definition. A willless and speechless human held to have died and been supernaturally reanimated. In other words, brought back to life. Now, in a modern zombie is a relentlessly aggressive, reanimated human corpse driven by a biological infection. And if you watch any of them now, you see that's usually because of some biological thing that went wrong and these people became zombies. Now, and they all kind of just drag around, and move slow and body parts fall off and things like that, And they don't scare me so much. But if you've ever watched the movie World War Z, those guys run fast and can jump over buildings, and that's the ones that would scare me. That's the ones that you just can't get away from. But no matter what you watch, and if you notice there's a greater emphasis on these type of movies, that it just portrays a sense of hopelessness, that the world is heading towards a terrible end, and there's no hope for life, and that just seems to be what's behind it. Are there zombies in the Bible? Well, let me see what you think about this. Remember that definition, a reanimated life. In 2 Kings 13, verse 21, it says this. Once while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders. So this was Moabites who were coming over from another country to raid and conquer them. They'd come in and steal everything. They saw this band of raiders, so they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. Now, first off, before we get to, you got to choose your pallbearers carefully. It turned out good for the guy. They just threw him somewhere. But if these had been the same guys that would have been trying to lower their friend down to Jesus through the roof, somebody said boo, and they'd have threw him off the roof. You got to choose these guys carefully. But I know that this really isn't a zombie. In the Bible, this isn't what this is talking about. But how sad would it be that this would be the only way that a person ever came back to life, or there was another life? or even so sad that it never happened. America has an extreme interest in the coming back to life, to seeing the afterlife or visiting and coming back. If you don't think so, just Google that, the afterlife or coming back to life. There are thousands and thousands of books and articles that are written on it. This is the one that blew my mind. There's even books on how to visit the afterlife. It's not like, how do you lose weight? It's how you get to visit. It's a self-help book of how to do it. But you think about the popularity of books like 23 Minutes in Hell. Many of you probably have heard that book, an account of someone who says they died and went to hell. Or even more popular, the book 90 Minutes in Heaven. That book alone has sold 6 million copies. Many accounts of people saying they've experienced the afterlife. And as you see, we see on the screen here, we're in the middle of our series that is called Beyond Belief, where we're looking at some things that just really kind of blow our mind, that stretch our mind to think about what some of the things that Jesus has told us, and it's beyond what the normal we would believe. And nothing fits that better than to talk about Jesus coming back to life, the resurrection of the dead. But whether it is beyond belief or hard to believe or just blows your mind, it is something that is the foundation, one of the core foundations of belief in Jesus Christ and what a Christian is all about. It defines what Jesus' mission and what his promise to every Christian is. On the morning that Jesus rose from the dead, you know that some of the women disciples they were the first to arrive at the tomb. And when they get there, an angel speaks to them. And in Mark chapter 16, starting with verse 6, it says this: "Don't be alarmed." This is the angel. He said, "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." This is the pivotal moment in history. This is where everything changes. This is where, whether you believe it or not, people can say, but we have a mistaken idea that if we say we don't believe something means it didn't happen. But whether you believe it or not, this is a pivotal moment in history. Everything changed. Many people believe that Jesus is real, that he was a man who walked this earth, that he taught and he did miraculous things. But not everybody believes that Jesus is risen. Real and risen is the difference. Our core 52 scripture this week is from 1 Corinthians 15. And Paul is dealing with, as he always did, he's dealing with a question or a problem or something the people there have. And so he is talking to them about this very important subject of the resurrection, coming back to life. And so so that tells us there was someone that was questioning. There were people questioning whether there was the actual afterlife. And we know that there were groups who believed either way. And so Paul begins to write and tell them about something. So I want to look at 1 Corinthians 15. This is where we'll spend the rest of our time. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 1 and 2 says this: "Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand." In other words, hey, remember what we came and taught you. And that's what you believe, that's how you confess Christ, and that's where you've taken your stand. "By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain." Now don't forget what he says there. And then Paul goes on and reminds them of some of the things that were part of that gospel that he preached to them. And he lands on talking about Jesus rising from the dead. Skip down to verse 12. It's 8 verses here, so it's a little bit longer. But starting with verse 12, it says this: "But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God. For we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead, but he did not raise him if, in fact, the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ are lost. And you know all of the comfort that we find as we talk about that somebody's already died, that we believe that they're with the Lord. And Paul is saying, if there is no resurrection of the dead, hopelessness. Your loved ones who have died before you, those who have gone on, it's hopeless. He goes on, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than all men. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Jesus is real, and Jesus is risen. They cannot be separated. Do you feel the weight of those words that I just read? The weight of what Paul is trying to convey to these people is not just enough to feel good about Jesus, but you must recognize and believe that Jesus has risen from the dead, and how everything hangs on those two things. Some of you know the name Leonard Tolstoy, the great Russian writer and Christian. Listen to what he wrote in the late 1800s. He said, "My question, that which at the age of 50 brought me to the verge of suicide, was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man, a question without the answer to which one cannot live. What will come of what I am doing today or tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Why should I live? Why wish for anything or do anything? Is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy?" That's a man who's dealing with the biggest question in life. If this is all there is, then what is the use? He's talking about what hope is it? What purpose is there in life if there is no resurrection of the dead? But Jesus' resurrection points us to the reality that transcends the mortal body and the afterlife. Mortal and immortality. For you see, in the end, Christianity rests not on whether you like Christ's teachings, but whether or not he rose from the dead. Whether you think he's a nice guy doesn't make it real. It's whether or not he rose from the dead that gives power to what Jesus says, real and risen. The fact of the resurrection was accepted at a time in history when there were abundant living witnesses. Let that sink in. There were abundant living witnesses to Jesus coming back to life. And there were abundant witnesses who did not like Jesus. So you had two sides. A side that says, we have seen him, the tomb is empty, he spoke to us. You've got hundreds of people who saw him. But you've got also others who are opposed to Jesus who would not have gone along with if that was a lie. So you've got people who would have proved and disproved the resurrection then. There were multiple appearances over a wide range of settings and times. It is, if it was legend, if it was not true, it would have died with that generation. But yet it lives today 2,000 years later. And if this old world lasts for 2,000 more years, you know what? The resurrection will still be taught. It will still be believed. It will still be the cornerstone of our faith in Jesus Christ. Yet still people doubt it. I've read this week you remember back in the days when the people would write into the newspaper, like to the Ann Landers, and she would give advice. Well, this was one of the Christian ones, and they'd write to a guy who had named himself Eutychus, just to have a biblical name. Somebody wrote in and said to him, our preacher said on Easter that Jesus just swooned on the cross, in other words, kind of just passed out or faked death, and that his disciples nursed him back to health. What do you think? And this Christian writer wrote back, he said, "Dear reader, beat your preacher with a cat of nine tails with 39 heavy strokes. Nail him to a cross. Hang him in the blistering sun for 6 hours. Run a spear through his side. Embalm him and put him in an airless tomb for 72 hours and see what happens." A new world exploded when Jesus rose from the dead. A new world view exploded upon the scene. The disciples' lives were transformed from people who were terrified to people who were bold. The church was born. The church blossomed. But none of it would have been without an empty tomb. None of it would have been true without been able unless there were eyewitness encounters. After the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Christian community suddenly adopted a set of standards, a set of beliefs to live by that were brand new. And they lived by them. That lived opposed to the world in which the civilization they were living in at that time. And you know what? They continue to today. And as many times as we look at our world and say that our lifestyle is so against or opposite of the world around us, well, we're just in good company. That's just how it started. That our Christian lives start and stand in opposition to the rest of the world. But if the resurrection is true, if it is true, there is hope. That word, hope, and reason to pour ourselves into this life we live now. The resurrection must be dealt with by the skeptic. And we easily recognize that the person who does not believe that Jesus rose from the dead, they must deal with that. But they're not the only ones that must deal with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Christian must deal with it. Because if it is true, then it will change totally how we live. It changes totally how we view life. In John chapter 11 is the story of Lazarus. Most of us here could tell that story without ever opening our Bibles. Lazarus is a good friend, a follower of Jesus Christ. His sisters are Mary and Martha. Lazarus takes ill, seriously ill, deathly ill. And they send word to Jesus several days away that your friend Lazarus is sick. Will you come and heal him? Because they have all the faith in the world in Jesus. They've seen him heal people. Will you come and heal Lazarus? His sisters have sent us to come get you. And if you were one of the disciples standing there right then, you would think, man, we're going to hop on things. We're going to double time it all the way to where Lazarus is so he can save him. But if you know the story, you remember the story, it says that Jesus just said, okay. And he waited a couple more days. He didn't do anything. It almost seems like that he didn't care. That he was nonchalant. He doesn't seem worried or flustered by the news of the impending death, illness and possible death of one of his best friends. Dean Smith, former basketball coach, said, "If you treat every situation as a life and death matter, you will die many times." Jesus doesn't approach life or death in that matter. He doesn't, in that way, he doesn't approach it like everyone else does. And as we read this story, we see that Jesus finally says to his disciples after a couple of days, he says, Lazarus has died. He's gone to sleep. But then he says, let's go to Lazarus. And they're like, and I'm thinking if I was one of the disciples, I'd say, why didn't you come to this conclusion several days ago? Why didn't we run there? But he says, let's go. So that by the time that Jesus gets to the home of Lazarus, it says that he has been dead for 4 days. He's been in the tomb for 4 days. And Jesus comes to it, and he comes to the tomb, and he tells me, he says, roll the stone away from the tomb. Roll it away. And in John 11, verse 43, it says this. When he had said this, and what he's talking about, if you read back, he's just prayed to God. He's prayed to his Father. And he says, when he had said this, when he had finished his prayer, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. He was like a mummy or a zombie when he walked out of that tomb. How could Jesus be so unhurried, so calm, so unflappable that he waits 4 days to come? And you're sitting here going, it's because he knew what was going to happen. And it's almost like that. It's almost like we're going, well, I wouldn't be upset too if I knew what I was doing. I could turn to the person and say, give me about 30 seconds. I'm going to raise this man out from the dead. Be watching. Get the GoPro ready. And we almost discount it because we think Jesus knows what's going to happen. That's the point exactly. Jesus knew what was going to happen. Because of Jesus' life and Jesus' power and what he was able to do, he says, I can look past death and know exactly what's going to happen. I don't have to be worried. I don't have to be flustered. I don't have to think this is the end. You see, he had a perspective when he heard about Lazarus and when he looked at a tomb, he had a perspective no one else has. He still has a perspective that no one else had. And this is the exciting thing. This is where believing and knowing and trusting in Jesus Christ coming back to life changes everything. Jesus not only saw it, he not only saw past life and death, he peeled back the curtain for us and said, look. Look. So this life, this impending death, does not have to terrify us because we've seen the other side of the curtain. We've seen what's on the other side. And when we look, it changes everything. And not just at death. Many of you are blessed to have had loved ones and church members who, when they found out they were dying or had a disease and they know their days were numbered, they were brave and they faced it and said, well, I'm not afraid to die because I know that I'll be with the Lord. I'll have my reward. And that's awesome. But it goes even further than that. That it can reach out to how we live every day. That we're not controlled by the fear of this life and the uncertainty of this life. You see, the resurrection means not merely that Christians have a hope for the future, but they have a hope that comes from the future. We have a hope that came from the future. Look again at that last line. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Why would Jesus say that? The same reason he said, roll the stone away. Lazarus doesn't need to be in a tomb anymore. He doesn't need to wear grave clothes because he's not dead. The grave clothes, these strips of cloth, this mummy as we would picture in our mind how they'd wrap bodies up, would only hinder him, would only hold him back from going back to living the way it should be. Let me ask you this. This is where it gets real practical for us. Are you still wearing the grave clothes? Are you wearing the clothes that just hold you back? What are the grave clothes that Jesus would say you need to take off because I've overcome this world, I've overcome sin and death? Is it simply fear? Fear of 1,000 different things? Is it the grave clothes of selfishness, where I've got to put myself first and I can't sacrifice for others? Is it worry? Is it worry that is what hinders you and holds you back? Is it the past? Maybe the past failures, the past sins, where you came from, where you think you're trapped to always be? Is it the fears? Is it the grave clothes of failure in the past, the fear of failure in the future? See, the list can be 1,000 things of what the grave clothes that you still carry around with you. But when we recognize and realize and accept that the resurrection of Jesus Christ changes everything, he says the same to us: take off the grave clothes and let him go. Live like someone who knows what the future holds. Live like someone who has seen the other side of the curtain.